This episode was chosen by my Patreon, so if you want to have a vote in what the next video is looking like, maybe you join the Patreon, you know? Look at this motherfucker. Look at him. He's looking at you. Suezo is a monster that, in the year 2022 at least, seems to exist specifically to give lazy and uncreative people ammo to make low-effort sexual innuendo and Mike Wazowski jokes, but believe it or not, he used to exist as a monster in Monster Rancher.
I still do, but I used to too.
Suezo gives weirdos on social media and YouTube whose friends have done both them and society at large a disservice by never taking them aside, sitting them down and letting them know that they aren't funny, the ability to regurgitate the same half-cocked jokes ad nauseum. And while that makes life just a tad bit more bitter for people trying to put out quality content for the niche like yours truly, I can't fault Tecmo for not being able to tell the future. But it does open the door to other questions given their foresight. Was making a cartoon Beholder, the mascot of your burgeoning monster franchise, a good call? Was attempting to add a new franchise mascot in each additional game a good call? Was Evo a good call? Probably not, but much like Suezo's vision, hindsight is most definitely 20/20. Or just 20, I guess. Suezo is an interesting pick as a beginner monster because he's got a pretty strong fundamental stat spread and playstyle, but not necessarily one that new players will quickly pick up on. His lack of defensive stats is far from being unworkable, but if you're a new player, your only frame of reference is the AI Suezos, which unilaterally follow a trend of high offense and pitiful defense. A type of build that is sometimes extremely powerful for the given rank, but pretty exploitable and inconsistent. Luckily, this isn't really how Suezo tends to work out in practice. If you watched the most recent tier list video, you might have been surprised with how high up I put him on the list. Truth is, Suezo has the tools to do everything well, even if his intended playstyle given his stat gains would suggest otherwise. Suezo has a couple of unique niches on top of a tech list that's already significantly stronger than average. Like Mochi, all of his techs at least do some withering, but unlike Mochi, his techs don't suck. Part of what makes Suezo known as a particularly good pick for beginners and farming cash on a new file is the strength of its basics. Decent force and good withering for 12 guts with an extremely quick animation time make Tail Assault a multi-purpose spammable basic tech. While held back a bit by the bad hit percent, it has the potential to be a pretty oppressive tool if used multiple times in a row. Spit is pretty similar in its usage, but trades damage for consistency. In a single player game, it's completely doable to roll through the entire game with just a Suezo arm with Spit. Spit is just as quick as Naga's stab and just as accurate, which as we know is a recipe for success. Not a lot of monsters have access to both one intelligence and one power basic, and that's usually a good thing since this is almost unilaterally a big ol' fuck you to competitive consistency, resulting in your monster using an attack that does no damage and costing you games. And while Suezo isn't immune to this, a strong part of Suezo's kit that is lacking from some other monsters with this distinction is that he can run both terrifying intelligence and power builds, all with the added bonus of being able to cover up his off-stat basic tech with other good attacking options that don't feel like compromises. Bite is a solid heavy tech that delivers exactly what it promises. Good damage, great animation time, and surprisingly high withering for a heavy tech. Bite ends up being malleable despite its minus 12 hit. You're not always going to land Bite, but for 21 guts it covers up Spit and gives you solid burst potential at a relatively low risk factor. But if you're sitting there thinking, okay, cool, Bite, yeah, fine, it's Bite, whatever. It's good, but it's missing a certain je ne sais quoi. Then let me introduce you to Tongue Slap. Yeah, that's right, we're going Foco mode early in the video. No brakes on the Suezo train. Huge damage, huge withering, stupidly inaccurate, but most importantly, it goes... Tongue Slap is a surprise game winner more often than not. It's Suezo's best anti-tank tech, which is only more impressive considering we haven't even looked at his withering techs yet. Teleport is Suezo's only power hit tech, and while it's fine, it's actually weaker than Tail Assault. It ends up being a more expensive and slower version of Spit for a bit more damage and a decent amount of withering. But the damage output is just a bit too low to be consistently usable unless the meta calls for it. I love using Tiger's Stab as a litmus for measuring other special techs against because it's just a really powerful multi-purpose tech that does what it does well and helps close out games in a way not a lot of other special techs manage to. It's not the best tech in the game, but it's a target other techs should aim for. Tiger's gimmick is high critical hit rates, and Suezo's is high incidental withering, though in a lot of ways Chewing is Suezo's analog to Stab. Chewing's withering is often enough to help block out monsters from mounting counterattacks, while Suezo recoups a solid chunk of the fairly expensive 45 guts attached to the tech. While the same instant game-ending potential of Stab is present on Chewing, the significantly lower chance to proc a crit results in Chewing being a different means to a similar end. And that's all of Suezo's power techs. Despite only having 4 non-basics, he ends up having tools for any matchup at his disposal. Regardless of competitive ability, Suezo is known more casually as a predominantly intelligence-based attacker, so let's take a look at those techs now. As previously mentioned, Suezo's strength tends to lie in its withering, but unfortunately in Monster Rancher, when withering is the focus over everything else, things tend to unravel. Lick is probably Suezo's worst tech, and while it does do respectable withering, the really low damage and accuracy hinder Suezo more than the withering helps. Lick is a very rare pickup for most players because it covers up Spit, which usually does a better job at advancing the game state in your favor. Kiss's numbers don't look significantly better than Lick at first glance, or second glance either to be honest. but the marginal increase in damage and massive boost to Withering help play a better control game than Lick by a significant margin, and it also helps cover up Tail Assault, so it's got some utility as well. You just need to hit it first. Telekinesis is Suezo's lone hit tech on the intelligence side, and that quality is probably the main reason to use it. Suezo's other intelligence attacks outside of Spit aren't particularly accurate, and while Telekinesis' damage is a little lacking given the price tag, plus 21 hit is kind of insane and gives Suezo an accurate way to close out fights after doing damage elsewhere. Telepathy is a pretty standard low-level sharp tech. It does a bit of everything with a hit percent for a cost that isn't great, but becomes very cost-effective if you're able to proc a crit. With Fame and the Bad-Natured Stress bonus, you'll do this 35% of the time, which turns Telepathy into a really efficient way to chunk your opponent's HP. I-Beam is your main damage source on the intelligence side. You get to do a big laser frame one that's powerful enough to raise some builds from the face of the earth in a single hit, given the potential 44% critical hit chance. -7 hit is the only drawback here, but with how quickly Suezo gets back into the game on a miss, it's usually worth swinging. I suppose I've seen builds in the past for Go picking up I-Beam, but it's a staple pick and consistent game winner on 99% of intelligence builds for Suezo. Yodel is like chewing if the damage and Withering were reversed. Extremely detrimental for your opponent when it connects, Yodel does a passable amount of damage, backed up by Withering so high that it often stops them from being able to attack at all. Against lower guts rate monsters, chaining a couple of Yodels together is enough to stop them from ever playing the game, and at 45% chance to hit, it can more or less come down to a couple of consecutive coin flips to win. It's a little risky for a win condition, especially when compared to chewing an I-Beam, but it's not a bad option. As we talked about off the top, Suezo has not only competent, but extremely powerful builds on both sides of the offensive spectrum. He's got a lot of possible variations and permutations given an otherwise small tech loadout, and with no tech chains, getting exactly the techs you want with no filler is incredibly easy. He's not only a beginner-friendly monster in the base game, but also a very rewarding and forgiving monster to build for competitive play. For a power build, Suezo is capable of using any and all of his power techs in conjunction with each other to make an array of builds, but this one's my favorite. Bite is your weak link here, but it helps further cover up Spit, so it has both damage and utility. Tongue Slap is a gamble but can instantly win you the game, and Chewing is all but necessary regardless of whatever power build you decide to go with. I usually skip out on picking up Teleport because I don't like how low the damage is, but if you feel like you need more consistency, far be it from me to say that it's not worth picking up. His intelligence techs are much of the same in their wide usability outside of Lick. Kiss covers up Tail Assault and can help win games easily. I-Beam vs Yodel is usually a choice you have to make, but you can pick up both if you'd like. Telepathy more often than not becomes your most consistent source of damage despite looking lackluster in the numbers department. Spit and Telekinesis do a lot of work to close out games. All monsters can run speed builds by default, but Pink Eye has a guts rate of 10, which also allows it to run a competent tank build with Anger, further boosting its Withering potential. DX introduces the ability to use White Suezo though, who has a guts rate of 9, which to be honest is kinda ludicrous on Suezo. Starts with I-Beam and Telekinesis, two techs you'd be hard pressed to ignore on an intelligence build, but techs that nonetheless rule out the possibility of a power-based build, making Pink Eye your best bet if you want to run power over intelligence, and White Suezo the best for the reverse. White Suezo also starts with Grit, which is a rare and powerful battle special, as a lack of Grit can often be enough to remove a monster from consideration in competitive play, though it also does get real, which by design is a double-edged sword, so if you're a more risk-averse player, maybe you'd prefer the Pink Eye regardless. A lot of the time in gaming, a franchise mascot ends up being a jack-of-all-trades type guy, and in Monster Rancher that's usually pretty bad for competitive viability. Suezo bucks the trend by being hyper-offensive casually and still very oppressive in competitive play. He can run a ton of different terrifying builds from heavy Withering, to cheap and reliable chip damage, to high critical hit percent, to unga-bunga insane damage gambling. So I guess he is sort of a jack-of-all-trades, he just happens to avoid the second half of the adage. Thanks for watching another one of these rundowns. Work has been kind of insane, so I haven't really been able to put as much work into video editing this month as I've wanted to, but I got it done in time, look at that. Thanks again to everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.